All right. Hi, everyone. This is the Growth Well podcast brought to you by Oabona Kgenwenyane, the Group Managing Director, Innolead Consulting. We're back again. As I've always said, we will bring to you every week conversations with very key resource people that will bring us some insights on a particular subject. So there's no difference today. Especially today, actually today is very special because we are launching a very special partnership with one of the leading schools of business in Africa, also one of the tops in the world. This is Gibbs Business School based in Johannesburg in South Africa. There's a partnership that as Innolead, we've worked on it for about 18 months now, and the objective being to improve our packaging of the services, especially around capabilities and skills and talent, which you'll agree in Africa, we need those so much. So let me start by introducing our guests. Professor Lyal White from the University of Pretoria, for which Gibbs falls under. So he's straight from the Gibbs Business School. But let me not talk about him. Let him introduce himself. So Lyle, welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Mr. K. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an enormous pleasure and privilege to be in Botswana.
100%. And we welcome you. We welcome you. And I hope we've received you with some warmth.
As always, I've heard all about the warmth and I've felt it firsthand this time.
Excellent. So, Lyle, just tell our listeners just about who you are. We debated earlier that I'd rather you do it than I do it myself.
Okay, so from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so yes, I'm with the Gordon Institute of Business Science, part of the faculty there, but in my role as faculty, I'm also involved in global partnerships, so that whole internationalization, building a coherent international strategy, which is something in an area that I teach in at Gibbs. I teach in the area of international business strategy, I suppose, and the environment of business, but also alongside leadership. I'm obsessed with how we can make strategists better leaders and leaders better strategists. That's in the teaching space. The other hats that I wear, and we chatted about this briefly, I'm a member of the board of the Association of African Business Schools, which is the largest collection of business schools across the African continent. And in that capacity, again, various hats, but I'm research chair for a forthcoming conference called the ABS Connect. It's the largest gathering of African business schools, which will be hosted at Gibbs at the end of May. So it's an interesting one. And then I've got a couple of other little pokers in the fire, as it were, and associations. But one of which is also as an associate, a research associate with the Brenthurst Foundation, which is also based in Africa, doing work across the African continent, through which I publish a great deal of my applied research that really looks at the intersect of policy development and the role of business.
So with this podcast, we try to enrich the listener with insights and ideas that can really contribute to the growth of Africa. We all know the challenges that we have. And I like the way you've described your background because it makes you so relevant. Leadership, entrepreneurship, Africa, business schools, because business schools are there to really try and assist in triggering this much required acceleration of growth for the betterment of our people. And as I said, at Innolead, what we wish to attain is really, and we are based in Botswana, but we're trying to now, we call it Innolead 2.0, where we're now going to impact more people across the globe. These things happen as you age, you have a bigger social type mandates. So we will be talking more about, leadership, entrepreneurship, even at country, at continental level, as to really how we can start making impact. I was talking to one of your colleagues at Gibbs earlier about how in Africa, we have such top schools like Gibbs and others, but there doesn't seem to be a linkage between, there was a debate a couple of years ago about Africa Rise, that everyone was getting excited. That seems to be sort of ebbing away now. So I'd just like to start by having your view around at that macro African role in the world and this hope that one day we will make a difference and make a meaningful contribution as well. Just like China sped up, Singapore sped up, Taiwan sped up. When is our time coming?
When you speak like this, it reminds me of the old adage around Brazil. They describe Brazil as the country of the future, and it always will be. And I think you make reference to recent history in Africa, and especially that between 2000 and 2010, Africa enjoyed the fastest growth decade on record.
That's correct. Yes.
And now what's happened?
Yeah, that's exactly my point.
And have we actually embedded this growth into some type of institutional improvement and has growth translated into progress and benefits to the population? I think Africa, in my mind, has now adopted that same mantle as Brazil. We are the continent of the future, and we always will be. But what will change this, Mr. K, is going to be leadership, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm a little bit worried about when people like you and I talk about, or maybe even because we slip into this academic mold of preaching about leadership, and leadership becomes kind of a cop-out because, what's the problem? It's leadership. So, but what about leadership?
Yes.
So I appreciate, and therein lies a great deal of appreciation around your question, is because it wasn't just, okay, so what is, and you didn't say, well, what is needed leadership, and then that's it. But what type of leadership?
Yes.
And today, in earlier conversations, you and I have engaged on transformational leadership, leadership that looks beyond just the immediacy. And I suppose leadership needs to, and that's where it becomes strategic, right? But it's something that is more sustainable, that is mindful of some of the most daunting challenges and biggest issues of our time as humanity, but how they're playing out in Africa. So therein comes in the context again, right? The context in Africa is unique. And I'm not overstating this by any means.
We are different. We are different.
We are different because of the size, the diversity of states, the span of languages. I mean, we have over 2,000 dialects in Africa. But what really makes us very, very different has been the way we were disconnected from the rest of the world. Let's be frank about this. And but how Africa isn't just going to be maybe the continent of the future. It's going to represent the future when you look at the demographic trend. Right now, I can see that we have about 1.5 billion people
in Africa now.
Yes, that's great if you've got a number. It's a throwaway number. Okay, what 1.5, and then people talk about numbers in China. But China's now got a diminishing population. The only one that can really come close now is going to be India. But 1.5 billion people in Africa. That, since 2000, that's a doubling of population literally in the last 20 years. Just think about that for a second. A doubling of the population in the last 20 years. And
that's
then by
phenomenal.
20... Yeah, and now speaking back, let's speak back to the future again. And when you speak back to the future, by 2040, that 1.5 billion people is going to be 2 billion people. And more importantly, the rates of urbanization are the highest in the world. The median age in Africa is 19.
Yeah. So the majority of those are young people.
So your topics for this podcast around growth, Africa's future, entrepreneurship, are more pertinent now than they have ever been before.
But taking it down to really practical levels in terms of structures, we have the African Union. I know we've got the 2063 agenda that they've laid out. We've got regional blocks. And I'm picking on your international aspect of the business school. And then we've got SADC. I have the privilege that my wife once worked in Addis. So we used to go to Addis quite a lot, being exposed to the headquarters of AU, because I used to try to dissect the impact of the AU in terms of leadership and actually making impact in our specific countries. Then we've got SADC. So I'm still there at the macro level to say, talking about leadership, what would you say are the key ingredients that are required for whether it's more creative, whether, as you said, we got to contextualize. Maybe we're taking cut and paste from somewhere. Maybe we start talking about Finland, and those are totally different models. Because sometimes in Africa, we like benchmarking. We think everything that comes from outside must be brilliant. I'm always critiquing in Botswana to say, guys, you can't go to that country and say you can plug it here and it works. We are different people, like we discussed in leadership. The other example I gave was the aspect of bonuses that are based on money. That totally goes against our culture. And I've seen the divisiveness of bonuses in organizations because basically you're separating people. You are, elite and you perform better, so you get more, and the other ones. But that's not Ubuntu. That's not our understanding. So I just wanted to appreciate, based on these, what should the leadership at Africa macro level should really be trying to look at to start fostering that breakthrough that we desperately need. You traveled in Africa. You've seen people basic without water, without modern electricity, last estimate was like that 600 million Africans without access to modern energy. Still using wood, and those are the challenges I'm talking about.
Those are the realities,
The realities on the ground.
And the realities and leadership has to be, it shouldn't only appeal, but it must be applicable to the hard realities that are on the ground. So in quick response to the first part, the macro areas or the macro kind of criteria of leadership, I think you almost alluded to it in the question, is it's not just, and this has been I would argue, that maybe we've also been too obsessed with the macro and too obsessed with the inherent patriarchal view of leadership on the African continent, waiting for those guys and women now, of course, but it was predominantly men.
Yes.
Maybe part of the
problem. From the chiefs and kings
of the African Union and all the rest, but how it must just filter down. But that's the first takeaway is greater accountability in maybe the lower ranks. And when I say the lower ranks, ordinary people like us, let entrepreneurs be leaders. Let them lead the charge of innovation and growth. They too are leaders. We shouldn't be waiting for a response from our governments or from these supranational institutions. We need to lead the charge on that. And I think that's really, really important. And that also that speaks to the urgency and the speed at which we need to respond in terms of our leadership. And they need to be, but Mr. K, to this is that we often take script from global institutions, global leadership frameworks. These need to be, you mentioned contextualized. I would say they need to be even more granular to a very deeply localized context. And by that, I mean, beyond even national, it has to be localized to the extent that what might be working in Gaborone might not be working in other rural parts of Botswana. And we see this. The response, the developmental response, and that needs to be led across the continent, has to be done in some of the nether parts. We call it often inclusive localism.
Okay.
And that's
inclusive localism.
Yeah. So we're mindful of the great global needs or the great inequalities or inequities, but the solutions have to be both localized and there's local solutions, and they need to actually not only appeal to the locals, but also applied by the locals. And they've got to be adopted quite deeply with local expertise and creativity.
Do you think that has been part of the problem? That it's been too much top-down type approaches and disconnect?
I think it's a disconnect. And I think this disconnect has been prevalent through decades in Africa. And so there's been a disconnect, and I speak about how maybe Africa has not been connected to maybe global value chains or global markets. But there's a disconnect between the leadership, and we see this. We see this in many of our countries. We talk about also the age problem in Africa. So there's not an age problem. We just spoke about a youthful population. But then you juxtapose this with an aging kind of presidential class, let's call it, or elite. And that's a disconnect. And look, it's not up to you and I to criticize, but it might be up to you and I to highlight these issues as issues that we should, in our own leadership capacities, be mindful of, and to talk about these and to see how we can actually bridge those divides and maybe help try rectify the disconnect.
No, absolutely. When you talk about the macro level and the fact that leadership has to be localized, as entrepreneurs, people like myself should start taking more ownership of issues. I was just thinking that, one of the challenges is that there's a cultural positivity, there's a cultural hindrance. In other words, we actually come from a patriarchal type in heritage.
Yes.
So people tend to look up to their leaders. I always tell people that is why in most Southern African countries, even if the leader is not telling the truth or what, they'll be voted. Simply because he's the king, he's the chief. And it's not that they're not intellectualizing the fact that, that manifesto is because, man, this is our president and he should continue being our president. You know what I mean? Just from an obedience. So I just wanted you to just check with me as to, it's a good point that people need to take on, but there's a bit of things that needs to be actually strategically addressed because they will hinder that empowerment. And we all talk about empowerment, take charge, civil society, da-da-da-da-da. But are there things that we need to look at that actually impede that?
Okay, so you're talking about some inherent issues that we have that have become quite structural in the African context. And I would probably respond, or I would argue that these inherent structural constraints to a new and a progressive approach to leadership comes from a particular cultural disposition, it's a cultural area of a cultural adoption that we have around leadership. So now we come back to context, and if you think about contextual leadership, contextual intelligence, it comprises, if you have to break it down, in our understanding in the African context, it's very much something that's around perhaps globalization. Globalization has prompted greater cultural diversity.
Yes.
It's also, but contextual intelligence is innately a deeper and a greater awareness. And then very importantly, there's a massive intercultural dynamic to this in our contextual intelligence in Africa. And that intercultural awareness or understanding or appreciation must always also translate into an intercultural communication. So if you wanted to break all those that big contextual intelligence down, that's the framework that I look at. And why I enjoy this framework is I do think that this speaks to where we are in Africa. It speaks to actually something that we can address and we can discuss and we can learn from. But the best part about it actually provides us with a very workable, viable solution to our leadership constraints. And a final point on this actual leadership, because I quite like your suggestion around taking ownership and the role of leaders in the entrepreneurial class, if you like, is. Leadership is an interesting one, and we've got these preconceived ideas of what leadership is that have been, again, kind of lectured or prescribed to us. But I think one is a leader when you need to start by leading yourself as well, and only then. And we had the age-old problem of, were leaders born or were they developed?
Yeah, so they can be taught and they can be developed.
And what you've alluded to here is leaders that are born. Instead of leaders that are maybe developed. And I think maybe that might be a bit of a cultural, an inherent cultural constraint to our leadership on the African continent.
No, it is. And you can even bring it at individual and family level. We grew up under a culture where you didn't really question your adults. The kids today, you say one, they say two. And you ask, young man, you can't talk to me like that. It's like, but why? So he then does.
Maybe we didn't grow up in the right era then, Mr. K.
So also these all play out in different things. And then as a family or at home, you obviously, these kids actually, I always tell them, the good thing about being a father or a parent is that these kids force you to grow. They hit you and you develop as a result. You become a better parent because of the kids, because of your wife, and so forth. Now, back to leadership. Now, in terms of now coming down to country level, we are all at different sort of speeds of development. We've got new kids on the block in terms of Rwanda coming in and outdoing a lot of others, and then we've got Botswana, which has been sort of the shining example of democracy and development. At one stage, Botswana was actually the highest, was a double-figure GDP growth in the 80s into the 90s, 13%, just like what China did much later. So we were the darling of the world in terms of GDP and development. And we've got South Africa, we've got the big economy, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and all that. They're busy shopping. I see that Nigeria fell, South Africa has taken the top position again.
It's always between the three.
Yeah, exactly. Then you got the top four sort of GDPs, Botswana, Mauritius, Seychelles, and all. It's always been around those countries, and obviously Rwanda is catching up. So I just like your view in terms of whether one can relate this zigzag, higher performance, drop in performance. Can we relate it to leadership and leadership styles? And the objective of the question is that from an African context, are we in the end being able to define what effective, appropriate? I did this course many years ago as a young man called situational leadership, where you manage and you lead according to the context. Goes back to our context story. So do you think we're getting somewhere where the Americans write a lot of books, from Lincoln to Washington to all the, to Ronald Reagan. So you get the flavor of what they see as an effective leader. So from an African,
Yeah, okay. So I think this is a fascinating question. So it's because, especially in the African context.
Yeah.
Let's never forget that contextual intelligence occupies both space and time.
Okay.
So space, the place. I mean, it's time. It can be, it's the past, present, and the future.
Yeah, where we are.
So it's hindsight, insight, currently, and then foresight. But we must never forget about the spatial one. So going back to your leadership question is, you get leaders that are actually effective at a particular point in time or a particular period in time. And they might not be relevant or they might not be as effective now. And that also could be in our practical interpretations right now as a result of exposure, social media. Who would have thought many of the great leaders of generations past, I don't think they would have survived social media. We're not going to delve into that. But
some of us still struggle with it now.
But what I do think is interesting about your question is what your assumption might be around progress and advancement. So you're saying, we've got the FOSS growers, and then we've got these.
Yeah.
Is Rwanda an exceptional case of progress in Africa? This is a country that is still predominantly reliant or dependent on development aid. So have they created their own industries? So this is just on the economic sense. And then let's delve into the question of democracy, So because many people would think that progress would be establishing a workable and equitable liberal democracy.
Correct. And even sustained progress. That's more sustainable.
And we know for a fact that some of the fastest growers in Africa are not even close to any form of a liberal democracy. So I do think then this comes back to our question of what we might interpret or understand to be true progress and advancement for any country. And we have for a long time looked at the likes of Botswana, Mauritius, and therein you referenced per capita income.
Yeah.
And I find those interesting because per capita income, when you and I were youngsters, these were interpreted as true positives of progress and growth.
Yes.
Earlier today, you referenced a range of indices. I'm obsessed with indices, by the way. So whenever if you reference the competitiveness index, I do agree, and the innovation index.
Yes.
I would say that herein you and I sit very firmly in a similar area of interest, a similar camp of interest, let's call it. And what I would have done is I like to see how some of these countries that have got positive economic growth rates in per capita terms, perhaps, because they can be distorted. You know, we can always, as economists, I'm a recovering economist.
Recovered.
Yeah, so you can always distort the numbers to reflect a very, very positive growth rate or positive kind of area of development. But if they've got a positive GDP or GDP per capita, you put them alongside, you couple them alongside a couple of these, some of these indices, like the competitiveness or the innovation index or the HDI.
HDI, yeah.
But what I would do is I would actually start clustering some of these indices and you form a composite index. And I've done this exercise.
Isn't it? You've done that.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
And then your index that you refer to, it's probably the most important one right now, which people are trying to augment. But a lot of the policymakers don't refer to it because they don't believe it provides them hard empirical data or hard empirical points of reference, and that's the happiness index.
Yes.
And the happiness index is quite simple because it looks at unemployment, it looks at inflation, and it looks at per capita income. But you can augment it further. And I think, and then you have the inclusive, the inclusive growth index, which is another interesting one.
Yeah. From inequality as well.
Yes, but the inclusive growth index will start incorporating these. And what is interesting, that's a UN, it might be a UN or a World Bank one, I can't remember. But basically, in that one, real human advancement, the advancement of citizens, does not hold a correlation with GDP growth rates. So that's just a nice little economic problem that we're dealing with. But why it is interesting for you...
Which talks to time as well, that it means that time-wise...
And why it is so interesting for you and I, sitting here on the African continent, is we quickly then realize that those indices, while they are very important and very interesting and useful points of reference, can never be, you know, the be-all and end-all of our metrics of success. They can never provide us with a silver bullet solution. They provide us with some points of reference. And why we need to actually be more mindful of our own numbers on what and how we should measure, and why we need to get those metrics right, and why we need to actually perhaps start measuring what truly counts on the continent, because that will shape our decisions. That will help prepare our leaders for better understanding. And when I say, we can look for our own numbers and we can look for these types of metrics, they're going to be very, very different, because then it takes us into this slippery realm of economic constructs. We are currently prescribing, solutions to from textbooks that are 100 years old. Theories that are over 100 years old, from textbooks that are 50 years old, for a generation that needs to thrive in the next 50 years. We need to really think about our own economic constructs. And that's, I know we've moved off leadership, but leadership has to start somewhere. And the leadership, the interpretation of these things and strategizing around this starts with understanding the numbers. Final point on the numbers. And you made reference to this. You said, one moment Nigeria is the biggest, then South Africa, and then it's Egypt and whatever. And you'll recall this maybe some 8 or 9 years ago, when Nigeria became the largest economy on the African continent in GDP terms. Yeah. And they did it overnight. Yeah. They leapfrogged South Africa, as everybody called it.
Oil, as usual.
Yeah, and no, it wasn't oil.
It wasn't oil this time.
No, it was not oil. It was the basket of goods. They had not... statistics in Africa, unfortunately, are poorly kept.
Yeah.
So we didn't have the real numbers. We got very poor numbers. It was a book written by a man called Morton Jervin. Okay. And basically, a lot of our economic decisions and the decisions made by entrepreneurs and other business people were based on incorrect numbers. And so overnight, they included things like Nollywood, or they included mobile technologies and things. And that suddenly made Nigeria the biggest country in Africa in GDP terms. But Mr. K, you know what else it made Nigeria? And this has not been documented. This is by Professor Lyal White.
Yeah.
It might have also made Nigeria the most unequal country in Africa. Because the numbers had not been actually calculated correctly.
That's very sad.
Yeah.
That's very sad. In summary, before we move on from the leadership from Africa-wise, I just want you, for the listener, to really summarize the answer, whether it's not possible or we look at the numbers, or there is no particular model that if I if I win elections in Lesotho, for instance, is it the right question to say, where do I look for a model that's contextualized for Lesotho from the business schools leading a country? That's really where I'm getting to. Is it something that I can look for, apart from the generic stuff that everybody talks about in terms of manager, leader, this, that, numbers and stuff? Is there such a thing? I mean, maybe such a thing does not exist.
You're looking for a kind of an example or a best practice
best practice that's contextualized for Africa, as we've talked, contextual wise, that if we look at this, an African country has a better chance of thriving.
Yeah. So I think, and it actually goes to what I wanted to maybe mention, is we need to look for more best practices across Africa, but it might not be an entire country. It might just be in certain areas. But I would also say that that us in Africa can look at comparative examples. And yes, maybe a Singapore or something might be too far away in terms of its development journey. But there are many in Latin America that could present an interesting one. I just, you mentioned Lesotho. And Lesotho could take, and it did take advantage of the AGOA.
The AGOA, with the textile industry.
And so therein lies an incredible example where Lesotho took advantage, and they could look across and they could say, but Vietnam also took advantage of a preferential access to a massive market and developed new industries. You must remember,
manufacturing there is pumping,
manufacturing. But one of the best stories about Vietnam is that yes, it was manufacturing, and they got preferential access out of guilt from the United States many years ago.
Absolutely.
But what did they do with that? They built an incredible industry, and that industry is coffee. The second largest producer of coffee in the world is Vietnam, after Brazil, because they produced at a time in the 70s a low grade coffee that just that pleased the consumers in the United States, in that midriff of the United States market, and they were able to land those. So they were able to land these processed agricultural products.
Okay.
And it's a basic example, but those are maybe the examples. Self-discovered industries. How did Colombia in Latin America, in the Andean region in Latin America, become one of the largest producers of cut flowers in the world? Again, it was a preferential trade agreement with the United States that enticed them, that nudged them to develop their logistical capabilities, their air traffic capabilities, so that they could, because it's a very short flight to the United States.
Yes, from there, yeah.
So, and they had the right climate and all the other things.
And the soil.
So the best practices do exist, and there are many best practices across Africa, which we don't often document or celebrate.
That's really the point, or even known.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I do think that in terms of leadership, I think that there are also more localized versions of stellar leadership across Africa that we could take notice of.
Yeah.
You said something very, very importantly today. You said many of the best examples around the world, you don't remember the leaders, but you know the countries that have progressed.
Yes.
And you think about them around the world. Of course, we know Singapore and we know Lee Kuan Yew. So maybe that was an outlier.
Yes.
But Uruguay,
Switzerland, Japan.
Japan.
Recovery. I don't even know who was involved in that.
Japan's a fascinating example for us because of the fact that Japan does have, they look very far in the past and they look far into the future, and it's this measured progress and growth. Whereas, Africa, we're always trying to grow very quickly, and we don't know what the future looks like. So that's a fascinating one to look at.
You're talking about Uruguay.
Yeah, Uruguay so think about Uruguay. It's one of the best examples in Latin America. Tiny little country. And they've diversified. One of our biggest problems in Africa as well is single industry.
Botswana is pained by that much.
And so how do we actually then help the country develop alternative or greater diversity in industrial development? And Uruguay was one of those. It was a single industry country, and they looked at where they could become competitive. And then there was a slow process, and then they had the right leadership in place. And I remember famously the president of Uruguay refused to go and stay in these presidential palaces. He drove his old Beetle around.
Yes, I saw that on the papers.
And then when his term came to an end, unlike many of the other presidents in Latin America that go and they try and change the constitution so they can run a second term, he said, no, my time's up. And then he's gone. And nobody remembers what his name was and also where he is now. But wait, he put them on the map. So because he also made Uruguay, because you must also remember, Uruguay was ensconced between two large countries.
Two large countries, Brazil and stuff.
And so Uruguay thought, well, how do I service those countries? They're not landlocked, but essentially they were wedged between. So how do I link this? How do we build? And Yarin's a very interesting example for this country itself. Let's not forget, Uruguay is also the spiritual home of Mercosur, which is the regional bloc. Guess which other country is the spiritual home of our regional bloc?
Well, in Southern Africa.
Yeah.
Botswana?
Of course.
With the SADC here headquarters.
SADC headquarters.
And founded by the former president of Botswana.
So it becomes there's a great deal that we should never dismiss the incredible advantage of being the bureaucratic center, the bureaucratic center of a region.
Yeah,
therein lies some economic advantages and sophistication, a great deal of diplomatic sophistication that can have rubber for an influence across the region. I think it's fantastically exciting.
Yeah. Excellent. It's actually a good point to land into Botswana now, because this is a country that was founded after we moved from being a protected British type support protectorate, and then with a president who studied in the UK. 1966, we had independence, elections, and so forth. And then they are critics, but I always say that we shouldn't miss the point that based on the nuances of other African countries, and also from our cultural point of view, we had elements of democracy at quarter level. We had a lot of a consultation process. We call them terisanyo, lemorafi, with your people in terms of, and so those were sort of mingled with the modern Westminster parliamentary system to create something that, for me, that's what created the peaceful first, 2-3 decades. That those guys are not educated, Lyle. These are, the vice president, the cabinet. By the time we got independence, we had a few graduates within, So that's what I try to dissect, and I always tell people we need to study that more. How a few uneducated guys with a very visionary president can create a very stable model in terms of just that base. And then we are lucky. Then we got the diamonds, and they speeded up the economy. But the economy does not speed up under a defunct governance. So they found a home in terms of the governance. And as I said, we had this development process quite entrenched. But we seem to be now struggling with the next phase of Botswana Pty Limited. So I don't know how much you know about Botswana. So it might be a bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to borrow from international business to say, because we're all trying to find the answers, to say how does a country like this, which is relatively small, which is easier. That is why some countries like your Finlands and your Singapores, partly is because also they're homogeneous, they're small. So it's quite easy. They're contained, they're compact. So Botswana's got that advantage. But we're struggling to get away. And I've told you that in 2012, Michael Potter was here. He was almost begging to say, Botswana, you got it all. But please, you're underperforming based on your potential. So I'm just keen, and I can quote a couple of international visitors who, Richard Branson has been here, a famous entrepreneur who was the vice president at Yahoo, Salim Ismail. We hosted him here last year. He had the same thing where he said, for me, this is one of the few civilized countries that I've traveled more than 120 countries. And so we got all this goodwill that we need to leverage, but we seem to be struck. I don't know from from a leadership, how does that translate?
I think it's a fascinating, and I think it's a fascinating question. It's an important one, and it's a relevant one.
Yeah,
I know a little bit about the history. I've always been fascinated by the history of Botswana because I read with my background, my interest in political economy.
Okay.
And obviously, scholars like Danny Roderick they've written extensively about the development model. And to your
and your friend you mentioned earlier, what's his name?
James Robinson.
Yeah.
James Robinson and
No, the other one who've written a book that I said I've got a copy.
Greg Mills.
Greg Mills, yes.
Yeah,
Greg Mills has written a lot about Botswana as well.
Yeah, and Greg Mills, so these scholars come from quite a similar place. James Robinson and Darren Osamoglu wrote a famous book called Why Nations Fail.
Yes, I've seen that.
And so Robinson's actual studies started predominantly with Botswana, and I don't think many people know about that.
Is it? Okay.
And it's because of the type of leadership and the course that they take. So now to give credit to your forefathers, as it were, I think the simple answer is we can't run before we've crawled and we've walked. Let's do this in a piecemeal fashion.
Correct.
And you might agree, given your extensive travels and your exposure, is that what happens in Africa is we want to do everything a lot quicker. We are unrealistic with the turnaround time, and we say this to international investors. Every international investor, they enter African markets, not just Botswana, and they expect turnaround times in faster than anywhere else in the world. But actually, it is going to be a slower, but it could be potentially a much greater return than what they anticipated. But they're wanting it quicker because they can't quite understand the dynamics, and they are concerned about the risk that they don't quite really grasp.
Understand. Yeah.
So their natural human response is a quicker turnaround. Our people want a quicker turnaround because our people often didn't have the luxury of long forecasts into the future. We lived as Africans in the now, today and now. And what your forefathers did, probably unknowingly, was they slowed it down. You know, in sport, they say slow the game down.
Yes.
Slow it down.
They do this.
And they slow it down. Composure. Let's tap into what our key competencies are. Let's rediscover. Let's go back to basics. And so that's that. I would argue. Then the other thing that they did this does relate to your question.
Yeah.
But what I think is they were mindful of the West nowadays, and they would still do this. The West, by the way, they would push for what I've referred to as liberal democracy, but they take it one step further. They say no. So you must have liberal democracy because of course this is what works apparently. Not only that, you will have participative democracy and not representative democracy. In political studies, this is still hotly debated, these distinguishing features. And it is, just by the name, you can imagine, participative democrahy and representative democracy. Yeah. So I would probably say that you adopted, and I'm not a scholar of Botswana by any stretch of the imagination, there was a lot, they adopted, and they would say that we are having participative democracy, but with Botswanan characteristics.
That's correct. Yeah.
Because the participation was done in the traditional means of engagement. And I think that unbeknown to them at the time, laid the foundation for something. But the problem that we have with Botswana, as we have with many other countries, we are not in a static environment. Development is never static. It's a dynamic, and it's an ever-changing situation, both internally and with exogenous forces on the go, and especially for a small country that is surrounded by other countries. So we need to keep on revisiting and evaluating this model and innovating it. So the innovation is not just product and service; it's actually a mindset and a model innovation. And where we have now is, I think, maybe the biggest shortfall was because all the literature that was written about Botswana was, here is an African country that has not succumbed to the resource curse.
Yes.
But in fact, they all spoke about this over a very short time frame. I'm not saying that Botswana succumbed to the resource curse, but it's not exactly a Norway today, because there's no tech companies and all those that have actually emerged out of Botswana. Botswana's got a very unique situation. It's right at the center of
Southern Africa,
kind of Southern African. And I would say Southern African, and it could become the most incredible service-orientated country. The free movement of people is fundamental for Botswanans leaving and coming back, but also, more importantly, and as you and I have discussed, this is a very, very inviting place for people of all nationalities, and especially as South Africans. For us, it's a great privilege and a treat to come here. So I think what's happened is, I think that creativity and the innovative spirit and that entrepreneurial flair. And we were talking about indices. We should look at where Botswana sits on the entrepreneurial index. But I think that type of, and then we come back to the skills development and the leadership development of people, because that's going to be the real resource that will turn Botswana, and that will help Botswana realize the aspirations for a 2036 agenda.
There was a light bulb moment right there regarding the slowing down. By the way, there's a whole movement now. I'm reading a particular book, I forget the title, about how it's titled almost like slow down to be productive.
Yeah.
And in our culture, you can't do anything without a very deep-rooted consultation process. Whether it's a new bill or a new policy that's introduced, the minister and the team at the ministry and departments have to go all around the country. When two people get married in Botswana, it's a process.
So you got
And
to be
I know
careful.
young people get so frustrated when I Lyle, because the two families have to meet, first to knock and greet, and then they go apart. Then you got to send uncles and aunts to go and start talking about negotiations with lobola and bride price and schedules for the wedding, when it's going to happen. So it's a to and fro, and I have to say I was part of this. Not sure I love the culture of marriage and burials, but because as an entrepreneur, the bureaucracy sends us really crazy. But our old folks will take that time to consult. Today, even we have a lot of localized foreigners who would critique. You say, this thing of taking a whole half a year to introduce a policy, it's inefficient, it's da-da-da-da. So that's why I say it's a light bulb moment, because now I'm reflecting as to whether compromising who we are for this. There's a lot of critics around this efficiency, individualism, and productivity movement that's driven from the Industrial Revolution as to whether it's actually working for us, because it's detaching us from the humane side of things. So I don't know if you have a comment on that, but that's just something that I just said, this is quite interesting.
Yeah, there's an interesting tension that you've just raised.
Yeah.
Let's not confuse a cumbersome bureaucratic process with a bit more thoughtful process.
That's correct. That's what I'm referring to. Thoughtful, engaging others, because so that they feel.
Right now, Mr. K, we find ourselves in a stage in history, in a culture globally of immediate gratification.
Yeah.
We want everything right now. We want it all. We want it now, and it's. We literally want to enroll in something, and we don't want to take the time to actually do it, and we want to consume from the fire hydrant, and literally so. And these are things that we would have seen in science fiction films some 20 years ago, and I think we lose a lot of the rigor, of course, but we lose a lot of the depth, and then we also lose the human side of what we do. But I think you've introduced an interesting tension here, where we've got to also at the same time we can't allow this to be an invitation for deep for additional bureaucratic processes and slow kind of movement and things. Because let's just distinguish this. There's efficiencies, and then there's this other side of thoughtfulness.
Yes.
Deeper thoughtfulness around that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Now we're going towards the end, and we can't go towards the end without ending on the individual. Remember, we had macro. We talked about the region. We talked about Botswana. Now we're talking about how a collaboration like this between Gibbs and Innolead. And at Innolead, it is so special because for me, talent and skillful people that can look after themselves. There were references to this. Sometimes we over-rely on politicians and we've got to rely on ourselves. And you do that more efficiently if you are tooled. you've got the language, you've got all those things that are fundamental. Now, how do you see the individual leadership capabilities that can help grow the self, impact on your community, whether you're going social entrepreneurship, whether you're going enterprising entrepreneurship and starting your whole business, because we're still also struggling to deal. I mean, I write all this in my book about my struggles as an entrepreneur from our context, because it's got its challenges, it's got its fun part. And in the book, I talk about the fun part. So I don't know, any guidance for the listener on that?
So we spoke quite a lot about the role of business, and so businesses, and I think entrepreneurs know this. If they can solve a problem, it has
to start with the problem.
And they solve a problem for society.
Yes,
And I think increasingly we've got to revisit what the role of business is in Africa. I think businesses themselves and business people are going to be agents not only of change but of development in the African continent. And this is my response to not waiting for governments and the public sector to respond to certain things.
Yes.
And it's really, obviously there's areas of collaboration in that space. But it really is important to solve those problems. Now the second point here is that what a collaboration like this between basically two entities in different geographies, but actually within the same kind of sub-region and on the continent, that bring very, very different inputs into the situation. So
this is Innolead and Gibbs.
Yeah, Innolead and Gibbs. It's very much around bringing a couple of decades of learning and excellence into a cultural understanding and the cultural intelligence and responsiveness for transformational leadership. I think transformational leadership at that individual level, at organization transformation, and then national transformation are the three levels that we speak into. I do think, and I strongly believe, that it will be business that will drive the next agenda and the future agenda for Africa. And it has to be done by individuals that have the creativity and the drive to do so. But those that
how the hell are we doing right now in that department?
I think, you know what? Maybe I'm just an eternal optimist.
Yeah.
But I do think that that when you start looking at the economic numbers, I'm disappointed at Africa's progress between 2010 and 2020. This was supposed to be building off a decade of fast growth, right?
Yes.
And I don't believe we've actually put the right institutions in place, and we haven't built connectivity as effectively. But I do think that I think culturally we actually find in entrepreneurs that are actually trying to drive change beyond their immediate business, and they are seeing the opportunities. And guess what? That little 2-year kind of hiatus of COVID reminded us that we can actually do it. When we were disconnected from global value chains, next thing we had to be reconnected. And the data shows that many African entities and many African individuals filled in where the gaps opened up, where international kind of companies were servicing certain areas. And that was, for me, positive. And I don't think people are waiting around for governments to deliver them from the situations that they're in. I think they're trying to drive this themselves. And I think what we need to do is we need to develop with governments the right regulatory frameworks, and I think that will. And we've seen this in other parts of the world. There and again, we must never dismiss the power of comparative assessments with other parts of the world that have come through these similar levels of development, or maybe are juggling with them right now, and then rediscover new industries. I'm sitting here right in Botswana, and this is probably one of the most exciting areas for ecotourism. And we know about that already. But we know about the safaris. But there's and that's a massive multiplier.
There's a lot of emphasis on that at the moment. I mean, I've talked to very, very prominent people that have come to Botswana, and they fly in, and they see the fauna and the flora and the animals, and then they fly out.
Yeah.
And I see these guys still don't know the people of Botswana. In other words, the whole holistic tourism of understanding the culture, the people, we haven't closed that.
But
nicely.
you know what you
Yeah.
have? You actually, and back to our friend Michael Porter. I'm a scholar of strategy and Michael Porter.
Yeah.
So we can always go back to the 5 forces or the diamond model, but never forget that Michael Porter introduced in more recent years, in part of his whole strategy narrative and models, is the shared value model. And I think Botswana culturally already has that. So the shared value model is something that is around the sustainability of this.
Yeah.
But you have almost a geographical cluster that you can build off in a country like this, and it's all contained. So I think that's what he was probably referring to when he looked at this, and we've seen this in many studies, and I think there's a huge amount of potential when you look at something like this. If you start borrowing from these models that we see elsewhere, and then refitting it or repurposing it. Specifically for the context that we have here in Southern Africa.
Excellent. Now, before we end, I like to become a little bit personal. So expose yourself. We, in this podcast, I talk a lot about happiness. Happiness, thriving as an entrepreneur, thriving as a worker, thriving as an individual. What are those aspects that are key for human thriving? And when I say personal, is because I'm just throwing it back to you to say, is there anything that you can share that really makes you... I've just been amazed how people learn from other people, because people don't explore the aspects of what can make them happy. And so I say, that guy does this. I'm going to try. It's like, gee, I picked up from that guy. It also works for me because obviously happiness is very contextual. So I'm just keen to know what makes you tick. When you do this, you're like, man, I'm in cloud 9, dude.
Yeah, but it's a difficult one for me because I drew a lot of energy. I was very fortunate at a young age to be able to travel for work, and I had a curiosity for the world, and I still love to travel. So
traveling is a big thing for you.
And I love sport.
Watching sports, yeah. Participating or watching?
I used to participate quite a lot, and now I've become a spectator.
Like we all do.
And from South Africa, I've got a great deal of pride for what a very diverse rugby team has done.
That was amazing.
And when I travel, I've just been to West Point, just outside New York, and when you relate what our rugby team has done, and I truly felt that this was a country that was playing in the World Cup. I really did. And I get a lot of energy from my work. I spend a lot of time in probably unexpected places in South Africa, in townships. The township economy in South Africa, the Kazi, gone are the days when we were looking to try and help and support, but the latent economic potential in those townships is enormous. And I'm building, at the moment in my entrepreneurial journey, I'm building an edtech platform geared towards townships, building off these fiber-to-home solutions in South Africa, where they are offering uncapped internet access for R5 a day at South Korean rates of speed.
Wow.
This will change the whole African narrative. I mean, it's incredible. But I was late to the game of family, and so my claim to fame right now, Mr. K, is that I had 3 children under the age of 18 months at one stage. Just recently.
Really?
I've got a little boy.
So you got a little noisy house, busy house.
As a good middle-aged father.
Yeah.
And the strange thing was, I was writing to a friend of mine, an academic colleague on the other side of the world, and I said that maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, I couldn't even imagine children in my life. And now I can't imagine them not being there. But that's again a lesson in human resilience.
Exactly. It's sobering.
And I have a little boy of 3 and I have twin girls.
Ooh.
And the best part about it is they just think at this stage of their lives that I'm a rock star.
Oh, man. Congratulations. This is fantastic. I tell people when I had my first kid, even the speed on my car just slowed down. I start playing to the limits, because it's just, I want to be with these
Yeah, it's
these
incredible.
tiny, cute things. No, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. And then lastly, anything from your side that you'd like to share with our viewers, whether through this relationship of Gibbs, I think as your last short?
I'm most excited about this relationship in the way we are going to learn from each other, because I think as somebody that is curious about the world and context, I think I've got a lot to learn from you guys.
The collaboration.
And the collaboration. And I mentioned this earlier today. I like to, I work and I engage in conversation, interesting conversation with people that I just resonate with and I like. And I get such a great energy from our engagements, our brief engagements over the last
just a
couple
few
of
hours,
days.
isn't it?
It's fantastic.
No, excellent. Thanks so much. Hey, guys, this has been a rich, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that Lyle provides some really interesting insights from the world, from Africa to Botswana to individual, whether you want to be an entrepreneur or not. So fantastic, and we'd like to thank Lyle. I really appreciate it, man. And remember, Gibbs with Innolead are in town here in Gaborone, Botswana, but some of the programs are online. We're available in Africa. Remember, Innolead is also there in Zambia. These programs are available for you in the rest of Africa. So contact us or contact Gibbs in Johannesburg and get growing. So thanks very much for watching. See you next time.